Hello, BookTube. I'm here with a science fiction orientated video, and I'm going to discuss a term that I think most people are aware of and have heard, but might be confused by it. They might even have their own definition of it, and that is the golden age of science fiction. Now, that has been, bounced around for decades, and pretty well, a lot of people do have their own definition of it, and a lot of people opt to the quotation of the golden age of science fiction is 12. Or sometimes they hear 13 or 14. That was coined by a science fiction fan called Peter Graham, and he was in the Futurians, big fan in the 1950s, and he helped create a lot of conventions. He worked with Carr, who was an editor for, he was a big fan, so he created that. So it's been called 12, 13, 14. He probably originally said 13, but then changed it to 12 for some reason. But that's not that important. So most people sort of know that. So that sort of makes sense because at that age, that's when whatever you start reading, that's the golden age for you. But it's been termed otherwise. And before I get to sort of other definitions, I want to back up a little bit to the beginnings of all this. And I'm going to call the beginnings of science fiction the beginnings of magazine science fiction, periodical science fiction. And that is April 1926 with Amazing Stories. It was created and edited by Hugo Gernsback. Hugo Gernsback lived from 1884 to 1967. He emigrated to the United States in 1904 from Luxembourg. He was an inventor. He published dozens of magazines over his lifetime. And in the teens, a lot of them were electronic type magazines, scientific magazines. And he was also a writer, not a very good writer, but he was a writer. And he coined the term scientifiction in around 1915, 1916. I think it appeared in print in 1916 in one of his magazines, in one of his own stories. Now, when he started Amazing Stories, he wrote an editorial of saying, what he wants is story scientifiction. It's a contraction of scientific fiction. Now, he wanted stories that were sort of gizmo-orientated, but with real science, real details of everything like that, which kind of makes for dry stories, and people did find it a little dry, but it was something that was new and wondrous for people. So it was starting to develop, and, it was codifying and bringing together what eventually became science fiction, what it was, and that's sort of the beginnings. And in 1929, he was ousted. Through bankruptcy, he did not continue with Amazing Stories. Now he was. It's a bit of controversy. It was either he was pushed out possibly, or he did it himself. But he created two other magazines immediately in 1929: Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories. But by 1930, in the Depression, he merged those into Wonder Stories. And then in 1936, he sold that sold it, and then it merged with another magazine. It's called Thrilling Wonder Stories. Here's an example of one from 1939. It's got a Simak story in, hence I have it, but it also has Alfred Bester's first story, which was a prize winner with this, and it's a perfect example of pulp. Sort of 10 inches by 6.5, 7 inches, and rough cut page edges, very poor paper that browns very quickly. And, well, if I could smell properly, you could smell sort of an acidic, a pulpy type smell. And this type of publication, started in the 1890s, but it was for poor, not the slick magazines, not the highbrow magazines. And so science fiction started this way. That's a whole other discussion, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. But also during this time, even at the beginning of the Depression, another magazine was started, Astounding Stories of Super Science, with the editorship of Harry Bates, who was best known for his short story, 1940, I think it was October 1940, it was published in Astounding, called Farewell the Master, which The Day the Earth Stood Still was based on. But he was the editor from January 1930 to March 1933. And then it changed to F. Orland Tremaine, October 1933 to October 1937. October 1937 is a very pivotal year, but I'll get to that in a few moments. Now, there was some changes with this. The magazine had faltered a little bit because of the Depression. It had a name change around February-ish 1931, I think it was. And here's an example from 1932. And it's changed the name to Astounding Stories. But it still has this pulp size. It's the same size as the Thrilling Wonder, give or take. They were roughly about the same size. So this is a Harry Bates publication one, and then I have another one just as an example of F. Orland Tremaine. Street and Smith sort of bought the publication, and this is February 1934, and this F. Orland Tremaine. Again, it's not as rough page edges. It's a little neater with that. But let's get back to 1937. Now, 1937 was a pivotal year for science fiction. For Astounding, John W. Campbell, he was 27 years old. He was hired to become the editor of Astounding. Now, he started then, but F. Orland Tremaine was sort of, teaching him the ropes. F. Orland Tremaine left in 1938. So around April-ish, May 1938, was John W. Campbell was in his stride. So, and he nurtured a lot of writers. He had his own view of science fiction. He wanted to sort of lessen the super science stuff. And when there was, he didn't want the detailed scientific discussions in it. He wanted the writers to write as if people already know this. It's as if you're writing things about a time in the future that everybody understands what this is. Understands you don't need to go into the mechanics of space flight, or anything like that, because he wanted people to read the story as if they were reading it from that time period to a certain extent. And as I say, he nurtured other writers. See, during the 30s, the pre-period, a lot of the science fiction, it became that super science, still gadget orientated with Amazing and a few other things, and with some of Hugo Gernsback in the early 30s, but also Superman type stories. That actually Superman grew out of this, and the superheroes grew out of this. So that was an offshoot from pretty clear from the 1930s. This type of material, and some writers, Clifford Simak was one of those that got tired and got tired of the science fiction that was happening. And around 1934-ish, he sort of stopped writing. He didn't really send too much stuff in. But then when he heard that John W. Campbell took over Astounding, then he knew that he could write for Astounding. And so the first story was 1938, Rule 18. I think that was February 1938 that his appeared. And then following year, February, March, and April, was the Cosmic Engineers, and here's the February issue of 1939. And as you can see, the story, the title has been changed again. Not Astounding Stories, but Astounding Science Fiction. Campbell actually wanted to go further. He wanted to just call it science fiction, but another magazine started up just calling science fiction, so he only got Astounding Science Fiction. He wanted to get out of the sort of, he didn't like the Astounding Stories idea, but it worked. People did like it, and he also did the trimming. So these are nice trimmed issues, unlike the earlier pulp, rough edge ones. They were nicely trimmed at this point. And he, like I say, he nurtured writers. Like face to face, Asimov. He nurtured Asimov with his first story, who came in as an 18, 19-year-old, to writing, and he met him many times. And this is ushering in the era that was first called the golden age of science fiction. And that's John W. Campbell, because he changed the face of science fiction at that point. As I say, before that, to a large part, there was a lot of super science stuff, and it was a bit of a mess, during the 30s. And John W. Campbell changed that. He had his own idea of what science fiction would be, and he wanted more orientated, like character stories as well, bringing in other things, and it's phasing out a little bit of the definitely the super science, but also when there was space opera, there was a little more quality. He wanted adult science fiction at that time, and also he started putting in science articles in the magazine. And what's considered the first, and because this begins, as I say, the golden age of science fiction. So we can say 1937, October 37, when he started. But generally, there's one issue that has been considered the first issue of that ushered in the golden age of science fiction. That was July 1939, Astounding. This is the issue. It has Black Destroyer by A. Van Vogt, his first story. It has Isaac Asimov's first story, Trends. And then slowly throughout the year, Robert Heinlein published his first story there and continued publishing all the way up. And through the 1939, 40, 41, and so forth. The first term, or first age of the golden age of science fiction, has been called, was, as I say, let's say 1939, just for the sake of argument, because we'll use this as the date, to 1946. And Isaac Asimov basically says the reason why that ended the golden age of science fiction, 1946, is the atomic bomb basically brought science fiction into the real world, brought reality to science fiction. So it was no longer sort of the imagination. It was real. It was in the real world. So that is considered that. And also there's many other reasons. The foundational works of, and I'll use that, of science fiction and ideas and themes were developed in Astounding and during this period. Not all within Astounding, but a lot of it was. And that's, as I say, the Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics, this Foundation series, the Heinlein, as I say, throughout that. And another foundational story is Nightfall, and that was in September 1941's issue of Astounding Science Fiction, and that is sort of the first period. Now it's I think it's undisputed that there was so much quality during this time, and there wasn't much in the way of competition either. There were other magazines still at the time. The only one that was publishing probably equal-ish material was Startling Stories, which started in 1939. The other magazines, like Amazing, was plodding along, but the quality may not have been there to equal John W. Campbell's editorship and the Astounding Stories. However, that is not to say that the pre-1938 or pre-1938, there was nothing there. There was foundational ones too in the early 30s. There was The Martian Odyssey, that was published in Hugo Gernsback's Wonder Stories. The Martian Odyssey, July 1934, by Staniel G. Weinbaum. And then he started writing in 1934 as well. He wrote a lot of stories, and a lot of those for Astounding. And also, too, in 1936, in February, March, and April of Astounding, the H.P. Lovecraft's at the mountains, the Mountains of Madness, was serialized. So there's again foundational stories in pre 1938. So, but as I say, and I'll come back to that of foundational stories. Okay, so we got 1946 as the end date of the first one. Okay, and that kind of makes sense because even at that time, like the first published in the 1940s, first published books of collections. Donald Wollheim was the first, and Groff Conklin did one, and John Healy did one, a collection of science fiction. I don't have that on the shelf. I don't have it unpacked yet. But there were a number of ones, and it was the first time this was happening. And as I say, it was the pulp era as well, and it was the fading pulp era as the 40s went on, because the pulp magazines stopped and they went to sort of digest size, and they stopped using pulp paper as well. Now, there's also another period of what's considered golden age too, and that's sort of the 1950s, or sometimes Mike Ashley says it's like 1950 to 1954. But in 1949, in 1949, October 1949, Anthony Boucher and J. Francis McComas started up Fantasy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And there was only one issue that year, and then there was a couple in 1950. But in 1950, October 1950, Galaxy Science Fiction started under Horace Gold, H.L. Gold. And here's the first issue of that. And you could just look at it's Clifford Simak. That's the reason why I have it. Theodore Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, Fritz Leiber, Frederick Brown, Isaac Asimov. You know, this put a big dent, especially these two magazines, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, put a dent in John W. Campbell's sort of stranglehold on science fiction. There were stories that he wouldn't take because he didn't think it fit in his vision of science fiction. But you see, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, it's got fantasy and science fiction, so it allowed writers to write different material, more varied material. So a lot of writers that couldn't sell stuff to Astounding or the other magazines, and it was quality, they would go to Galaxy or Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And as I say, and that developed, that redeveloped, that was another development in science fiction. Because, as I say, Hugo Gernsback was one, creating this idea of science fiction and writing towards that. John W. Campbell did this, and these other ones opened up other people to write other things. And that also sowed the seeds of what became New Wave, with writers like Philip K. Dick starting at this time, as well as Harlan. Philip Jose Farmer, and a lot of other writers were starting at this time, and they were writing things that definitely Campbell wouldn't take. And also in the 1950s, it became more mainstream science fiction. Just look at the 1950s, science fiction, American science fiction films. That was a proliferation. It became popular. Mainstream publishers like Doubleday, Simon & Schuster started publishing material. Prior to that, it was mostly small press like Gnome Press, Fantasy Press, and other publishers, small publishers that were publishing science fiction. So now it happened in the main our bigger publishers were doing this, and paperbacks started coming out. So writers as well can write full novels and have it published and not be serialized, get paid more money. So there's a proliferation there of writing, but also too but especially in the early 1950s, there's a huge resurgence of magazines that started. So there was the arena for writers was huge, and then because of the paperback and everything that came in, it slowly dwindled in the late 50s, and the other magazines sort of faded away. Now, this is all American, the United States at the time, but there was also this was happening especially in the 1950s, was happening in England here. There wasn't too many magazines. The foremost magazine that started in 1946 was New Worlds, and it was edited by John Connell, and it was a foundational one for the UK. But also, too, in the 1950s here, there was a lot more, in late 40s, there were a lot more paperbacks being published, too. So a lot of science fiction went directly to paperback. So that created a different dynamic. So that's been called the golden age of science fiction here in the UK, especially in the 1950s, to a certain extent. Robert Silverberg called the 1950s golden age of science fiction for many of these reasons and more. And I think some of that has to do with he started writing during that time. So there's a bit of that as well. But that was another period. But then, as I say, 1950s, but they were developing other types of things. Like Philip Jose Farmer were written sexually orientated stories. They were going outside of the box, or John W. Campbell's box of writing. Now, that was the beginning of this. And then going back to New Worlds, in 1964, Michael Moorcock took over May and June 1964 of the New Worlds magazine. And he was a proponent of what turned out to be called the New Wave. Now, that includes the sexually orientated material, psychological material, drug material, sort of less scientific science, if you want to call it, or physical science, and more soft sciences, drug-oriented, I say sexual themes, social science was big, and then so around 1964, 65, this was a place, and that started to burgeon and explode with a lot of writing. And in 1967, Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions, Michael Moorcock was writing, as I say at the time. J.G. Ballard, Philip Jose Farmer came into his own. Samuel R. Delaney, John Brunner, Philip K. Dick. The list goes on there, and to a lot of people, that is the golden age of science fiction, is the new wave science fiction, which lasted up until the late 70s, sort of mid to late 70s. It made a big splash on science fiction. So that has been termed by some people as the golden age of science fiction. So these are periods that I'm going through. Like I say, Gernsback created the first sort of big splash with Amazing Stories and then John W. Campbell, and then the 1950s with a magazine of fantasy and science fiction and Galaxy, and the proliferation of science fiction and science fiction themes in other places and other medium, and then the next big one is the Michael Moorcock, the codifying, and the new wave era with the New Worlds. Okay, so and then that sort of petered out a little bit, and sort of the dust settled in the late 1970s. But also something that was growing out of that was cyberpunk, which was the next, I would say, is the next big period or big event. And the early 80s was a big one for that. And so a lot of people would call that the cyberpunk era as the golden age of science fiction. And then then there was sort of a one that sort of grew out of all this stuff is Slipstream. I don't know that much about it. I can't sort of put my finger on a lot of the material, but it's basically using fantasy, philosophical writing. It's a mishmash of different literary styles and literary styles all put together, and some of them not even science fiction themes, speculative fiction brought all together. So these are, it depends on, like, what you want to call the golden age of science fiction. Me personally, I like the material that John W. Campbell started up until, like, I would say the golden age of science fiction is from John W. Campbell, not 1946 the cutoff, but 1950 or 1951, with the publication of Galaxy, because, as I say, that stopped, that brought out other things, but also everything after that was fabulous during the 50s. There's another way of looking at it. Mike Ashley, as I say, called the golden age like 1950 to 54 roughly, but he also has coined the thing of classic science fiction, that you look at everything pre 1965 and before. For a while, basically a 75 period from 1895, the publication of Time Machine by H.G. Wells to 1965. So 75 years. Is that right? Yeah. But anyway, from 1895 to 1965 as classic science fiction. And that could be a really good term to use, because the new wave was very distinct from everything, from what came before. For the most part, it was being developed, as I say, in the late 40s and 50s, but it really changed things for science fiction. And yeah, it's whatever. I find it difficult to these days. I always thought it was 1938 to 1946 or 1950. I always viewed that as golden age science fiction, but all these other periods make sense, and you could even call the pre-golden age, the 1930s as a golden age too, because there was new stuff being done. Like I say, H.P. Lovecraft, Stanley Weinbaum, and all sorts of stuff, and even the creation of superheroes and stuff like this. This all was a resurge, a surge. It was surging up and happening. But like, I do like an interview that I just recently read by Clifford Simak in a fanzine called The Diversifier, March 1978, and it's a tribute to the golden age of science fiction. And all the questions to Clifford Simak is, what do you think is the golden age of science fiction? Now, this is where I'm sort of going to leave it, because I really think that he has hit the nail on the head with this. He doesn't think there really is a golden age of science fiction. He thinks that basically every year there are good stories and there are crap stories. Like, I'm paraphrasing this. And each era has good stories and bad stories. And, he just, whatever sort of floats your boat in many ways is the golden age of science fiction. I don't really like the term of the golden age of science fiction is 12 or 13. I don't really hold with that so much. But for the period, if it works, and as I say, there's quality material in each one. And as much as I don't like new wave science fiction, I have to admit there are new wave science fiction writers that I do like. And the same as cyberpunk. Slipstream, well, I sort of lost track somewhere around the late 80s for science fiction, a lot of times in the 90s. So I don't know. It was suggested that to me that another period that has developed recently is woke science fiction. And it's become very woke. That could very well, but that's going to have to wait a while to look back on and see if that actually did take or change anything in science fiction, rather than just momentarily bits and pieces. So, and I think it's just a development. A science fiction is developing. And always developing. Sometimes it goes backwards, in many ways. But it's also, and then when the dust settles on something, you hope. I think, and hopefully what comes out of that is the good stuff from something new that happened, and it merges with the other. With the older, and it creates something hopefully stronger and better. So, what is the golden age of science fiction? I don't have an answer. I personally like the period, basically before 1964 or 1965. I generally say it's BS. And I'll explain that in a second. But it's the classic science fiction. So actually, a good term is classic science fiction. So it's everything before. And 1895 is a good year to start because with the Time Machine, because that is very modern in many ways of science fiction. The science fiction before that is iffy, but some really good stuff. But anyway, when I say BS, I say before Shawn. So, and that's before 1966, before I was born. So 1965 and before it's so I like science fiction that is BS. Thank you, BookTube. If you have any thoughts on this, what is your favorite period of science fiction? Do let me know in the comments. Does any of what I said here make sense? That there really isn't a golden age of science fiction, or do you firmly believe that there is a golden age of science fiction, and why? Thank you, BookTube.